Buddy, it's Peggy. I'm glad to see you all again. 3 o'clock on Saturdays, our time to get together. I'm really loving to read this book to everyone. And one thing that the Lord has been doing with me is whatever chapter we're on, I tend to go through something that week that will, of course, not be the exact things as the book. It's an allegory, but our lives are a book too, right? And the Lord seems to teach me things as I'm going through reading to you all. And so I hope that He's doing that to you too, that He's touching your hearts and uh, just making you strong, like much afraid will be and is being made. And that's like with us. He sees us as we already are, but He sees us more so as we will be when we're completely whole. And so He makes us in the natural, little by little, into what we already are eternally. And that's a wonderful thing. Let it be, Lord, let it be. So this week, we're going to be on chapter 12, and it's called In the Mist. And some of you are on YouTube and some are on Facebook. And I hope you can hear me okay. And feel free to go on the chat function, and I'll try to see if you are and try to answer any questions. Otherwise, you can do that later, and I can always answer the questions during the week, which would be fine too. This is my little desk that I work at. I'm a medical transcriptionist, so this is where the magic happens. So, okay. One more thing before we start. One thing, when I just made that quirky little comment, the Lord told me this week, just be vulnerable, and it's okay to be a little kooky because that's you, So, so that's fine. He loves us, and we are special. So it's called In the Mist. So we begin. The storm, remember, from last week was really great, day after day after day. And now it's beginning to calm down. So it's at last, the storm gradually died down and the clamor on the mountains ceased. And it was time to resume the journey. However, the weather had broken completely. And though the storm itself was over, thick mist and cloud remained, shrouding everything on the heights. So again, she can't see where she's going. When they started, the mist was so thick they could only see the trees on either side of the narrow path. And even they looked ghostly and unreal. The rest of the forest was simply swallowed up and entirely lost to sight, veiled in a cold and clammy white curtain. The ground was dreadfully muddy and slippery, and although the path did not climb nearly so steeply as before, after some hours, Much Afraid found to her amazement that she was missing the rolling thunder of the storm, and even the sickening crash of the trees as the lightning splintered them. She'd gotten used to that day after day in that beautiful little snug cabin with her companions. She began to realize that, cowardly though she was, there was something in her which responded with a surge of excitement to the tests and difficulties of the way better than to easier and duller circumstances. It was true that fear sent a dreadful shuddering thrill through her, but nevertheless it was a thrill, and she found herself realizing with astonishment that even the dizzy precipice had been more to her liking than this dreary plodding on and on through the bewildering mist. In some way, the dangers of the storm had stimulated her. Now there was nothing but tameness. just a trudge forward, day after day, able to see nothing except for white, clinging mist which hung about the mountains, without a gleam of sunshine breaking through. At last she burst out impatiently. "Will this dull, dreary mist never lift? I wonder, and would you believe it?" A voice she knew all too well immediately answered her from beyond the trees. It was her enemy's. "No, it won't," replied Resentment. "Moreover, you might just as well now know that this is going to continue for no one knows how long. Higher up the mountains, the mist hangs thicker and thicker still. That's all you can expect for the rest of the journey." Much Afraid pretended not to hear, but the voice went on again, almost at once. "Have you noticed, Much Afraid, that the path which you are following isn't going up the mountain at all, but it's almost level? You've missed the upward way, and you are just going round and round the mountain in circles." Much Afraid had not exactly noticed this fact, but now she could not help realizing that it was true. They were not climbing at all, but simply moving along the mountainside with constant ups and downs, and the downs seemed to be getting more frequent. Could it be possible that they were really gradually descending the mountain instead of going up? In the bewildering mist, one simply could not see anything, and she found that she lost all sense of direction. On asking her companions what they thought about it, they answered rather shortly, because, of course, she should not have listened to any suggestion from Resentment. That they were on the path which the shepherd had pointed out, and would certainly not allow anyone to persuade them to leave it. "But," persisted Much Afraid petulantly, "don't you think that we may have missed the way in this mist? The shepherd said that the path led upward, and as you see, this one doesn't. It runs along the side of the mountain. There may easily have been a more direct way up, which we didn't notice in the mist." She's beginning to be affected by resentment already. Their only answer was that they knew better than to listen to any suggestion made by Resentment. At that, the voice of Bitterness broke in quite clearly. "You might at least be willing to go back a little way and look, instead of insisting on going on and on along what may prove to be a wrong path, leading you round in circles." Sorrow and Suffering took absolutely no notice, but unfortunately Much Afraid did, and said with still greater petulance, "I think you ought to consider the suggestion. Perhaps it would be better to go back a little ways and see if we have missed the right path. Really, it is no use going on and on in circles, getting nowhere." To this they replied, "Well, if we are going around in circles, we shall eventually arrive back where we went wrong. And if we keep our eyes open, we shall be able to see the path we missed, always provided that it does exist and is not just a bit of imagination on the part of Bitterness." "You poor little thing," came the whisper of self-pity through the mist. "It's too bad that you've been put in charge of such obstinate mule-like creatures." Wow, now they're getting really bad. They're pointing at others instead of their own selves. They're trying to blame things on her companions. "Just think of the time you're wasting getting nowhere at all. Trudge, day after day, nothing to show for it. and you ought to be getting up to the high places." So they went on, whispering and talking at her through the clinging mist, which shrouded everything and made it all seem so ghostly and dreary. Of course, she ought not to have listened to them, but the mist was so bewildering and the path so unspeakably tame that she found something in her heart responding to them almost against her will. It was very tempting to listen to those uh, answers and those deflecting and pointing it up to others. Suffering doggedly led the way. Suffering meaning her companion. And sorrow, just as doggedly, was her rear guard, so that there was no possibility of turning back. But Much Afraid found herself limping and slipping and stumbling far more often and badly than at any other stage of the journey. It made her very disagreeable and difficult to deal with. Wow. It is true that after every stumble, her conscience smote her, and she apologized sorrowfully and abjectly to her companions, but that didn't prevent her slipping again, and almost directly afterwards. Altogether, it was a miserable time, and the mist, instead of clearing, seemed to get thicker and colder and drearier than ever. Wow. So her attitude is beginning to be affected by her relatives. So why do you think Much Afraid missed the storm? Well, storms make us more dependent. They are exciting. And, plodding on, doing the same thing day after day can be boring. So that atmosphere kind of set her up for stumbling again. When we're just trudging forward day after day, what are some ways that we can look at that? Well, we can say we are still in His will, and we can rest a while. So we can't be in storms and running and, have it being at such a high pitch all the time. We need rest. We need peace, shalom, nothing missing and nothing broken, walking in peace. How did Much Afraid open the door to resentment? Well, she started grumbling. So started to open of her heart, of course. Remember in Exodus chapter 16 and 17 when the Israelites grumbled? See, they were now in an area they didn't know. All they could remember, all they knew was what was back in Egypt. So what was resentment's message to her? If you remember, resentment told her that the shepherd didn't know what he was doing and that he could lie and deceive. I've got a lot of things written down if I can only read my writing. What were sorrow and suffering teaching Much Afraid when they weren't listening to her relatives, ignoring them? And that's it, basically. Don't listen to lies. And what was their response to bitterness? They just ignored him. And what was her response to Much Afraid? Their response to Much Afraid? They quickly told her the truth about the shepherd and pointed her towards hope that he would take care of them no matter what. So what was self-pity's principal message? Well, that she was wasting her time and the shepherd didn't know what he was doing again and that he gave her bad companions. Now again, he's pointing towards her companions, deflecting. But she didn't choose those companions. The shepherd did. Let's see. When we go through sorrow and suffering, we can learn. Yeah. And she's learning. So let's see where they go from here. So stuttering, I think I read that already. Much afraid found herself limping and slipping and stumbling far more often and badly than in any other stage of the journey. And again, I think I read this before. It made her very disagreeable and difficult to deal with. Yeah. Altogether, it was a miserable time. And the mist, instead of clearing, seemed to get thicker and colder and drearier than ever. At last, one afternoon, when the only word which at all described her progress is to say that she was slithering along the path, all muddy and wet and bedraggled from constant slips, she decided to sing. It has not been mentioned before, but Much Afraid did not possess the gift of a sweet voice any more than a pretty face. It is true that she was fond of singing, and that if the shepherd sang with her, she could keep in tune and manage quite nicely. But if she tried alone, the results were by no means good. However, the mist was so thick and clammy that she was nearly stifled, and she felt she must do something to try to cheer herself and to drown out the ghostly voices which kept whispering to her through the trees. Isn't that something? She must do something to try to cheer herself. It was not pleasant to think of her relatives now having the opportunity to entertain themselves at the expense of her very unmelodious voice, but she decided to risk their ribald comments. If I sing quite loudly, she told herself, I shall not be able to hear what they say. The only song which she could think of at the moment was the one which sorrow had taught her in the hut, and though it seemed singularly inappropriate, she lifted up her voice and sang quaveringly. How lovely and how nimble are thy feet, O prince's daughter! They flash and sparkle and can run more fleet than running water. On all the mountains there is no gazelle, no roe or hind, can overtake thee nor can leap as well, but lag behind. That's from Song of Solomon 7, verse 1. There was perfect silence as she sang. The loud, sneering voices of her enemies had died away altogether. Look, that's all it took. It's a good idea, said Much Afraid to herself jubilantly. I wish I had thought of it before. It is a much better way to avoid hearing what they are saying than putting cotton in my ears. Remember when she did that? And I believe, yes, I really do believe, there is a little rift in the mist ahead. How lovely! I shall sing the verse again. And she did so. See, she's being proactive now, not reactive, not waiting, listening to what her enemies are saying. She's putting that praise into the atmosphere, and that's going to change. Praise changes the atmosphere. It just does. And it brings the shepherd's presence, I think. Why, Much Afraid, said a cheery voice close beside her. I have not heard that song before. Where did you learn it? There, striding toward her, with a particularly pleased smile on his face, was the shepherd himself. It is just impossible to describe in words the joy of Much Afraid when she saw him really coming toward them on that dreary mountain path, where everything had been swallowed up for so long in the horrible mist, and everything one touched had been so cold and clammy. Now, with his coming, the mist was rapidly clearing away, and a real gleam of sunshine, the first they had seen for days, broke through at last. "Oh, shepherd," she gasped, and caught hold of his hand and could say no more. It really had seemed as though she would never see him again. "Tell me," he repeated cheerfully, as he smiled at them all, "where did you learn that song, Much Afraid?" Isn't that funny? She can respond in a negative way and complaining and crying, and he comes and he responds cheerily to her. I remember one time I woke up in the morning kind of in a bad mood, and I said, "Good morning, Lord." And I heard in my heart, "Good morning, sweetheart." That's him, and that is how he feels about us. Wonderful about us. He loves us, but it also exposes. It exposed me, definitely. "So tell me," he repeated cheerily, "where did you learn that song, Much Afraid?" "Sorrow taught it to me," she replied. "I didn't think that she knew any songs, shepherd, but she said the words and the music came to her as we were climbing up through the forest." You see, you'll notice through this book that her companions' sorrow and suffering are being changed little by little also during the journey. So they are being transformed just as Much Afraid is. I asked her to teach it to me because I know I'm a goose, but it makes me think of the time when you will have made my feet like Hinds' feet, and I won't ever have to slither along again. And she looked shamefacedly at her bedraggled and muddy condition. "I'm glad you sang it," said the shepherd, more pleasantly than ever. "I think it is a particularly nice song. Indeed," he added, smiling, "I think I will add another verse to it myself. And at once he began to sing these words to the same tune. "Thy joints and thighs are like a supple band on which are met fair jewels, which a cunning master hand hath fitly set. In all the palace search wherever you please, in every place there's none that walks with such queenly ease, nor with such grace." It's from, again, Song of Solomon 7, verse 1. So don't think of yourself as less than, as a worm, or, I always mess up. Because really, these songs, these scriptures tell us how he does see us. We are the bride of Christ, male or female, we are. And he sees us as beautiful. And so when we think of ourselves as worms or as dust, that's not realizing the care that he's taken to create us and to walk with us and change us and help us through this life. Think of yourself rather than thinking of yourself as, "Oh, I'm a sinner, I always sin, but I'm saved by grace." True, but think of ourselves, we're joint heirs with Jesus. Now that's a high estate. He has made us joint heirs, and it's all because of him, and we're in him. But it's not about our behavior. It's about who we are. We are joint heirs with Christ, his beloved. I'll quit preaching now and I'll read. "Oh, shepherd," exclaimed Much Afraid, "where did you find that verse to fit in so nicely to the tune which sorrow taught me?" Again he smiled at her in the nicest possible way and answered, The words came to me just now as I followed you along the path. Poor Much Afraid, who knew that she had been slipping and stumbling in the most dreadful way, indeed worse than at any other time. She flushed painfully all over her face. She said nothing, only looked at him almost reproachfully. Let's see if I have anything here on that. Hallelujah. Yes. So self-pity, you remember, was talking to her, telling her she was wasting her time and that the shepherd didn't know what he was doing and that he gave her bad companions. But see what's happened? The shepherd came back. She sang. It changed the atmosphere. It even called forth his presence. And boom, he was there to help them, there to go with them. Not only just as a helper, but as a companion himself. So does self-pity ever get you with any of its messages? It can. And what happened to Much Afraid's walk when she listened to self-pity and bitterness and resentment? Well, she began to limp and slip and stumble worse than she did before. And the solution, of course, was she began to sing. And she began to say truth to herself and turn to the shepherd. Yeah. How did the shepherd respond to Much Afraid's actions? Well, he cheerfully appeared to her, bringing the sunshine, and he was glad she was singing. And what was his response to her shame? Well, we'll see. Much Afraid, said the shepherd very gently in answer to her look of reproach. Don't you know by now that I never think of you as you are now, but as you will be when I have brought you to the kingdom of love and washed you from all the stains and defilements of the journey. If I come along behind you and notice that you are finding the way especially difficult and are suffering from slips and falls, it only makes me think of what you will be like when you are with me, leaping and skipping on the high places. Wouldn't you like to learn and sing my verse just as much as the one which sorrow taught you? Yes, said Much Afraid thankfully, and taking his hand, certainly I will learn it and sing about the cunning master hand which takes such pains with me. See, she's beginning to see that she is worth something, that he's taking a lot of pains to help her. By this time, the mist had actually melted right away, and the sun, shining brilliantly, was making the dripping trees and grass sparkle with joy and brightness. All three thankfully accepted the suggestion of the shepherd that they should sit down for a short time and rest and rejoice in the sunshine. Sorrow and suffering withdrew a little, as they always did when the shepherd was present, leaving him to talk with Much Afraid alone. She told him all the dismal tale of their long wanderings in the mist, the way resentment, bitterness, and self-pity had been bothering her, and her fear that perhaps after all they had wandered from the path and lost their way. Did you really think I would let you stray from the right path to the high places without doing anything to warn you or to prevent it? Asked the shepherd quietly. She looked at him sorrowfully and said with a sigh, when resentment and the others are shouting at me, I'm almost ready to believe anything, no matter how preposterous. You had better become a singer, said he, smiling. Then you won't hear what they have to say to you. Ask sorrow and suffering if they have any more songs which they can teach you. Do you find them good guides, much afraid? Wow, there's a question. She looked at him earnestly and nodded her head. Yes, very good. I never could have believed it possible, shepherd, but in a way, I have come to love them. When I first saw them, they looked so terrifyingly strong and stern, and I was sure that they would be rough with me and just drag me along without caring how I felt. Oh, how I dreaded it. But they have dealt with me very, very kindly indeed. I think they must have learned to be so gentle and patient with me by seeing your gentleness. I never could have managed without them, she went on gratefully. And the queer thing is that I have a feeling that they really like helping an ugly little cripple like me in this way. They do truly want to get me up to the high places, not just because it's the commandment which you have given them, but also because they want a horrid coward like myself to get there and be changed. You know, shepherd, it makes a great difference in my feelings toward them, not to look upon them any longer with dread, but as friends who want to help me. Oh, I've got a chat from my sister Nancy. Beauty for ashes, she says. Oil of joy for mourning. Praise for the spirit of heaviness. Those are things he gives us in our journey, and we are changed. Thank you, Nancy. That's beautiful. So where did I leave? Yes. She finally sees that they really love her, her companions do, and they want to go with her of their own free will too. So they're all going to be transformed. As she finished speaking, she looked up in his face and was surprised to see that he actually looked as though he were trying not to laugh. He said nothing for a moment or two, but turned slightly so that he could look around at the two guides. And Much Afraid looked too. They were sitting apart in the background and were unaware that they were being watched. They sat close to one another and were looking away up to the mountains toward the high places. Their veils had been thrown back, although she still could not see their faces because their backs were toward the shepherd and herself. She was struck by the fact that they seemed even taller and stronger than when she had first seen them waiting for her at the foot of the mountains. You see, they're being changed too. And he gives us companions that will help us change. And sometimes it's, like this. Sometimes it's iron, sharpening iron. Sometimes it's embracing, but we are changed together, aren't we? So let's see. Why do you think the shepherd was trying not to laugh at Much Afraid here? I think it's because he delights in us and he loves it when he sees that we're finally getting it, right? And also, Much Afraid is changing her perspective of sorrow and suffering. So in the allegory, they're angels, beings with these characteristics and names, but we can change our perspective of sorrow and suffering also here on earth when we go through things. Of course, we don't go looking for those things. God doesn't put those things on us. But again, we're going to have sorrow and suffering at times. But our perspective can change it. Our perspective can change the atmosphere, and it can bring his presence. And that is what we want. Okay. So I need to learn to keep my place where I was. They truly do want me to get up to the high places, she said, not just because it's the commandment, but because they want to. It makes a great difference in my feelings toward them, not to look upon them with dread, but to as friends who want to help me. I know it seems ridiculous, but sometimes I get the feeling that they do love me. As she finished speaking, she looked up in his face, and again, it looked like he was trying not to laugh. Oh, that's funny. So the two companions now, there was something incredibly majestic about them at that moment when she's looking at them, a sort of radiant eagerness expressed in their attitude. They were talking quickly to one another, but their voices were so low that she could not catch what they were saying. Was it possible? Yes, it was. They were actually laughing. Sorrow and Suffering were laughing. That they were talking about something which thrilled them with eagerness and expectation, she felt quite sure. The shepherd watched them for a few moments without speaking, and then he turned back to Much Afraid. His eyes were laughing at her, but he said quite gravely, "Yes, I really believe you're right, Much Afraid. They do look to me as though they really enjoy their task, and perhaps even feel a little affection for the one they serve." Then he really did laugh out loud. Sorrow and Suffering dropped the veils back over their faces and looked around to see what was happening. But the shepherd had something more to say before he sped them farther on their journey. The laughter died out on his face, and he very seriously asked, "Do you love me enough to be able to trust me completely, Much Afraid?" She looked at him in the usual startled fashion, so natural to her whenever she sensed that he was preparing her for a new test, and then faltered, "You know that I do love you, shepherd, as much as my cold little heart is capable. You know that I love you, and that I long to trust you as much as I love you, and that I long to both love and trust you still more." "Would you be willing to trust me," he asked, "even if everything in the whole wide world seemed to say that I was deceiving you? Indeed, that I had deceived you all along?" She looked at him in perplexed amazement. "Why, yes," she said. "I'm sure I would, because one thing I know to be true. It is impossible that you should tell a lie." Wow. "It is impossible that you should deceive me. I know that I'm often very frightened at the things which you ask me to do," she added shamefacedly and apologetically, "but I could never doubt you in that way. It's myself I'm afraid of, never of you. And though everyone in the world should tell me that you had deceived me, I should know it was impossible." "Oh, shepherd," she implored, "don't tell me that you think I really doubt you, even when I am most afraid and cowardly and despicably weak. You know I trust you. In the end, I know I shall be able to say, your gentleness has made me great." Beautiful. Beautiful. That is how we're changed. That is how we're made gentle, and it's how we're made great, by being with him. He said nothing for a little, only looked down very tenderly, almost pitifully, at the figure now crouching at his feet. Then, after a time, he said very quietly, "Much afraid? Supposing I really did deceive you, what then?" It was then her turn to be quiet, or to be quite silent, trying to grasp this impossible thing he was suggesting, and to think what her answer would be. What then? Would it be that she could never trust, never love him again? Would she have to be alive in the world where there was no shepherd, only a mirage and a broken, lovely dream? To know that she had been deceived by one she was certain could not deceive? To lose him? Suddenly she burst into a passion of weeping, and then after a little while looked straight up into his face and said, "My Lord, if you can deceive me, you may. It can make no difference. I must love you as long as I continue to exist. I cannot live without loving you." He laid his hands on her head, and then with a little touch, more tender and gentler than anything she had ever felt before, repeated as though to himself, "If I can, I may deceive her." Then, without another word, he turned and went away. Much Afraid picked up a little icy cold pebble which was lying on the ground where he had stood. She put it in her bag and then tremblingly rejoined Sorrow and Suffering, and they continued their journey. Wow, isn't that something? I always keep my Kleenex with me because we know that I cry every time. So sorrow and suffering are now being changed too, right? So they were always very quiet and not speaking really unless they had to. And now they are being eager and expectant. And they are even laughing, sorrow and suffering. I remember once when I was suffering, I felt I was to laugh and laugh and laugh. And I did. I laughed and danced until I couldn't anymore. And it broke that suffering. The pain didn't stop, but the bitterness in the pain did. So again, we can change the atmosphere by our attitudes, by our praise, and also his presence will come. So the shepherd was trying to tell Much Afraid that something was going to happen soon, next. And she's probably going to feel that things are going to get worse. So what was the significance of Much Afraid's answer to the shepherd when he asked her, "Will you still love me if I deceive you?" Well, it was the deepest surrender she had ever done. The deepest that she'd ever made. Have you come to such a place like that? The deepest surrender? You can read in Job. That's a good example. Job 13, I think it is. Why do you think the stone that Much Afraid picked up was icy cold this time? I think it represented her allowing him to deceive her. And it gave her chills to even think about. It wasn't a warm and fluffy, thing. It was foreboding. So there were a couple of scriptures from this chapter. One was 1 Samuel 16:17. I won't read it because we're getting short on time, but it talks about the Lord looking on the heart. It was when Samuel went to choose the king, and he looked at all of David's brothers, but he looked on the heart of David. And also Psalm 121 about would I let you stray? And Ephesians 5:19. Let's see what that one is. I'll read one. 5:19. As be filled with the Spirit as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves, singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts. Verse 20, giving thanks to God the Father at all times and for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's got a lot of hope. It's got truth in it. It's got a lot of hope in it. And I pray that you will be filled with hope this week. I love you all, and I'm going to say goodbye for this week. And if anyone has it on their hearts to give, I will put the information in the comments, and I would appreciate it. And I love you all, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.